Hey everyone, today I'm going to be looking over all of my electric locomotives. This is the last part in my three-part series looking at all of the locomotives that I have in my O-gauge collection, as of the year 2024. So far I've looked at my steam locomotives and I've looked at my diesels. But now to go over a category that a lot of model railroaders tend to forget about, and that would be the electrics. As you could probably tell from my layout in the overhead catenary, I am quite the fan of electric locomotives, and I've learned a lot about their history, especially in the North American context. So of course that led me to want to collect models of all sorts of electric traction. Most of these models have been wired to run off the overhead. I've made countless videos showcasing this system, which I'm sure some viewers of this video might be interested in checking out. But right now electric locomotives are my area of interest, and I plan to get several more. So today in this video I'm going to be showing off all of my electric traction and models that I plan to get in the future. I suppose we'll start off strong with the first electric that I ever got. This is a Lionel LTI era Amtrak GG1. Mechanically, this is nearly identical to the post-war version, and, well, I mean, it definitely shows. This locomotive can pull an absolute ton, it's pretty fast, and it is very heavy. The entire body on here is die-cast, and all the components elsewise are either die-cast or steel. This makes it probably the beefiest of the locomotives that I have, which is fitting because the real locomotives were absolute units. I think it makes sense to start off with this one because, well, GG1s are the de facto American electric locomotive that everybody thinks about. Which, I mean, for good reason, it's very attractive. In real life, they hauled passenger and freight under many road names, namely the Pennsylvania Railroad and their successors. This one, of course, painted up in Amtrak. I think this paint scheme looks really good and it follows the lines of the old Penzi scheme pretty well. Although I'd like to get an MTH or Williams or even MPC Lionel GG1 in a more classic paint scheme. I have wired up this locomotive to run off of the overhead and it runs pretty good. The next locomotive is this Pennsylvania Railroad EP5. The real Pennsylvania Railroad never had EP5s, they were purely a New Haven invention. But I can see in an alternate timeline the Pennsylvania buying these. In real life, they were a pretty short-lived class of locomotives and had reliability issues. But in model form, they tend to work pretty well. This is an MPC era model that I got in box for, I want to say, $70. I made a review on it a couple years ago, if you want to go check that out. But it's had pretty reliable operation over the years, and just like the GG1, I've fitted this so it can run off of the overhead wire. The body is plastic and it feels cheaper than the GG1, but it's still a very nice locomotive to run. And I find this tends to be my go-to when running an electric freight train. You may be able to notice that I've raised the pantographs up so they'll make good contact with my wire, which I'll admit is maybe a little too high to be prototypical, but it's like that so I can fit overheight rolling stock. So that makes it a little annoying because I can't really swap out the pantographs if I want to put on a different shell. Which, speaking of that, I have another shell for a EP5, and that is this custom painted Conrail shell, which I feel turned out pretty good. I like the electric blue, it certainly fits the locomotive. And even though Conrail did have EP5s, they never painted them in this paint scheme. I can see in an alternate timeline if they had lasted a couple years longer they would have been painted like this. The only reliability problem I had with this locomotive is the E-unit was giving me trouble. Eventually it gave out and rendered this locomotive inoperable with it in, so I just decided to take it out and wire it for forward-only operation. As a result, this locomotive is perfect for running in circles, which is what I tend to do. Overall, I've had a lot of joy with this locomotive, and I'd certainly recommend getting yourself one if you're into electrics. Speaking of that, I've actually got two on the way. Both are also MPC, but From eBay, I've got a Great Northern and a Milwaukee Road paint scheme coming. Definitely expect a video on these guys, as there is a little bit of work that I have to do to them, make them run with my wire, and overall clean them up. But it'll be nice to have 3 of these units, and I'm certainly welcoming them to the collection. But seeing as I like to run this locomotive very often, I have a feeling that those are going to be the same way. The next set of electrics are these South Shore interurban cars. These are some of my favorite pieces of rolling stock, as I really like the South Shore line. In fact, I take the modern South Shore line quite frequently, so it's nice to have a model from that railroad. It is one of the few electric railroads in the Midwest, so of course I'd like it. I think K-Line did a pretty good job approximating the South Shore cars. They aren't quite accurate, but they're certainly close enough for me. When I got these cars, they actually had a very bright orange glow through the plastic, so I had to paint the insides for them to look decent. I think the marker lights are a good touch on the cars, and they really add some character. And by the way, this car does not have its pantographs operational. At least not yet. I'm planning to convert it sometime. I just haven't had much reason to. Sticking with the theme of interurbans, let's look at the opposite of the South Shore, the North Shore. I recently made a video on this car, but it is a sort of kit bash of a North Shore Line Greenliner car. It's made from a Baby Madison passenger car and MTH trolley trucks and trolley poles and whatnot. And I'm pretty happy with it. It runs smooth and the trolley pole looks nice on the wire. Plus, if I wanted to, I could run it on the inner loop and say that it's running on third rail mode. But overall, I do really like the North Shore Line too. And if you like the North Shore Line and you like this car, then definitely check out my recent video on it. This is a Brill streetcar. It was manufactured by, I think, either Bowser or Pittman. But it's a brass model, and it's my first brass model that I've owned and worked on. And I must say it runs remarkably well for such an old model. I've made some changes to it, most notably a new paint scheme, and I plan to add more details later. And I certainly plan to add trolley poles at some point. But there's really not much to say about this model. It's currently the only operating streetcar model that I have, and, well, I really like it for that. The next locomotive is this adorable little box cab. This was originally a Lionel 520, but I've made some improvements and changes to make it look great. People tend to dunk on this locomotive as, well, the original isn't that good, it doesn't look great, the cheap, flimsy fake pantograph is really crappy, and apparently people have had problems with their operation. But I must say, he cleans up nice. I was contemplating whether to paint it traction orange or a nice dark green, and I went with the dark green as it would look good pulling a few passenger coaches or a freight train. It usually plays a role similar to an interurban freight motor or a terminal electric. But anyways, aside from painting it green, I gave it some lettering and some other finer details. I gave it a mechanical tune-up, and I think most importantly, I slapped a pantograph on top of this guy. It shares this pantograph with my GG1, at least for now, until I can go find its own pantograph. Pantographs on their own tend to be pretty expensive. I think I might be the first person to have wired a 520 box cab to run off of overhead lines, as recently I made the switch with this locomotive. It runs reliably on third rail or overhead, and it can pull a decent amount. Anyways, this is definitely in the running for one of the cutest locomotives I have. Now on the total opposite end of the spectrum, we have this big guy. This is a early Williams E60 that uses a lot of Lionel components as it was a kit. I made a detailed video on this, and I'd definitely recommend checking that out, as I don't really see that many people talking about these. But this is an absolutely phenomenal locomotive. It's easy to work on, it runs beautifully, whether I'm running it off of third rail or overhead power. And yes, I have wired up this locomotive to run off of overhead. I think the Amtrak graphics look really good, and well, this is a reliable motor for passenger or freight. Which, even though it's in the Amtrak scheme, which is a almost exclusively passenger operator. This usually gets thrown on the front of a freight train, as that's what these E60s were intended for. But again, this thing has 2 motors, magnet traction, 6 axles, and it absolutely pulls hard. If you can get your hands on one of these original kits, I'd say it's one of the best E60 models you could ever get. And well, that's the last of the electrics that I have. Although pretty soon I'm thinking about getting a Conrail rectifier, or just some rectifier. I think the rectifiers look really cool and they're definitely a underrated freight outline electric. So expect to see one on the channel sometime soon. Oh, I forgot one more thing. Here's something that's been in model making purgatory for a few years now. This is probably recognizable to a few people as a Little Joe. The Milwaukee Road and the South Shore Line had these, and, well, those are 2 of my favorite railroads. They certainly have an interesting history, and, well, I really like them. They're a massive electric freight locomotive, what's not to like? But I haven't printed out the decals for this, and I'm still trying to work on getting the paint finish to a point where I like it. But once I do, I'm probably going to get it up and on the layout. It's designed to share a base with a GG1, but eventually I'd like to get it its own GG1 base. And while it won't be 100% prototypical, it's probably going to be pretty damn cool once I get this whole thing together, and it won't have cost me that much either. Obviously, this is just 2 F3s cut in half and stuck together with some paint thrown on them, but like I said, I feel like this is going to be pretty neat. And with that, that's all I have to say in terms of my electrics. Like I've said, this is a very active part of my collection, and it's a great area of interest to me. And if you're a fan of electrics and you like O-scale, then, well, you should consider subscribing to the channel because that's my area of interest too. And that concludes my 3-part series on all the locomotives that I own. This has probably been one of the more intensive projects I've done for the channel, but it's been very enjoyable nonetheless. So, thank you for watching. I hope you and your families have happy holidays, and I'll see you later.